my filtering isn't working well. So if I get blurry, I apologize. So if I get blurry, I apologize. So how about where I sit? So I'm Tim Olsen. This is the town hall on Federation. Got really excited when people said, hey, let's have a town hall on Federation. It's like finally my decades of watching Star Trek is finally going to come in useful. And it turns out, no, we're talking about XNAT Federation, but we'll make do. I did want to go and I was going to change their Federation logos to be the little XNAT symbol. I thought that would be a fun team logo. I'm Tim Olsen. I was the original architect and developer of the XNAT platform for the first 8 years. Interestingly, it's now been longer since I left that role than when I was in it, which is really cool to see XNAT live so long. Part of Radiologics, which is a spinoff from WashU, from the lab. We do a lot of commercial consulting for XNAT, running people's XNAT systems, and then have made a whole lot of contributions back to the community, the XNAT community. So the batch launch plugin, the direct to archive feature, DICOM filtering via regex to different projects. Configurable resource uploads. There's been a whole lot of things that we have just contributed back as open source software for you guys to make use of, in addition to just tons of bug fixes. So we are large contributors to the XNAT platform, and that's maybe why we're here today talking about this. Kate will be helping me to do this presentation. She's a senior director of engineering here at Radiologics, which is now merging with Flywheel, as you've heard. And then we'll have a group of panelists to discuss as we go forward. So in thinking about Federation, this isn't new. We've been talking about needing to support Federation in XNAT pretty much since the beginning. I think there were conversations probably as far back as 2005, 2006. Dan and I sitting around a desk saying, well, how would we do Federation? There have always been some core challenges, but those challenges have changed a lot over the years in ways that now this is a much more solvable problem than it was. The big blocker we tended to run into in the early days of XNAT was authentication, getting some sort of federated authentication model. We always felt like, we're going to have to create our own central authentication service and manage that. We were always thinking, we create access.xnat.org or something and have registered things and they'll get mapped to everyone's access. It was something we always felt like we had to solve. That's not really the case anymore, although there could still be an argument for something there. But the technology has improved. The options have improved so much over the years that there are options. We'll talk a little bit more about the challenges on the next slide. But so authorization, once someone gets access to a server, what can they access? Data heterogeneity, if people are accessing someone else's XNAT server, is it even the same data that they're accessing when I access the education field or the SES field? Are those even comparable values? And how do I know? That's a big problem. And then one of the big issues is one maybe we don't think of because it's not as technical. It's the governance of will people be willing to allow people to access their data from another XNAT server. So there have been many different approaches to how do we solve the federation problem. And they can look differently. There can be a peer-to-peer network of XNATs. That's been one idea. You can have more of a hub and spoke model where you have a lightweight centerpiece that's connecting to a bunch of other XNATs. You can have a centralized server, a centralized XNAT that's connecting to a bunch of XNATs. Different solutions there, but they all are kind of achieving the same thing where we want to access the data on someone else's XNAT. And so these are some of the problems we run into. In the history, I put in there that some of the first kind of attempts at this were things like Oasis Brains and XNAT Central, because they really are trying to solve the problem of how do I give other people access to my data? And the only way to do that back then, because of these obstacles up above, was to put it all on one server. And that was generally how a lot of the solutions have gone until recently, especially with the machine learning stuff. There was always this idea that even if you do have federation, can query into other people's servers, at some point you're going to need to get all the data you want onto your system or a system where you can use that to do processing. So in some ways, Oasis Brains and XNAT Central were public XNAT systems with data that was hosted. It's just all the work of federating that data was done offline. right? There's no automation to the process. There's no good technical solutions. One of the big ones that I've seen come along was the DPUK system. We have Matt South on the line today, and he can comment later in the discussion. These are some images from the DPUK, and this was very much as when we first started designing the DPUK system, there was a lot of talk of, hey, can we just make it a federated query? Can we just real-time queries into their XNAT data? And that got problematic for the reasons we'll talk about on the next slide. We ended up with first a project catalog notion, studies, a list of the studies that are available out in the world that are available on that website. They're really more manually entered and not so much derived from the data themselves. And then summary data that you can query into and drill down on data to identify a specific cohort that you're interested in. That's what these logos are for. So this was a solution in the direction of federation. And then currently there's a whole bunch of things cropping up on federation. This is becoming a very big topic. A lot of different groups are working on this. We did some work with MSpace last year. This was really neat. One of the great additions here was SSH key based authentication that has not rolled back into XNAT proper yet, but I think it probably should. If you had an SSH key registered, you could interact with your XNAT server as your user account. We used that for the federated communication between the XNAT servers, back channel communication. And then the Australian Federation, which Ryan Sullivan's on the line can talk about in a minute, as well as the work that Simon's group is doing on federation. So plenty to discuss. So let's talk a little bit more about the challenges. How will this actually work? Because often when we talk about it, it seems pretty simple. Why can't I just query into it? Map it as my, as soon as you start delves in the details, right? So, how will the accounts be authenticated and such? Authentication has become used to be the blocker, and now has become one of the really more straightforward solutions. It just needs to be done. But authorization becomes really tricky. Well, if I have a centralized server that has access into my system, is every user who does queries on that going to end up with a user account on my server? Am I going to end up with 20,000 user accounts on my server? That doesn't seem great. So how will that authentication work? How will that authorization work? Those are some of the important problems to try to solve. Data heterogeneity, right? I had to spell check it to make sure the spelling was okay. Is the data going to be, are the actual data structures that I want to query going to be present on all these XNAT servers, right? If I have plugins that are customized, those likely won't be on those other systems. But then, has the data been pre-processed in a way that I need? Have annotations been done in a way that's uniform? Okay, annotations might be there. Are they comparable? Right, that's a whole other question. So lots of complexity comes in, and then governance ends up being one of the biggest blockers. Will your CIO even allow this to happen? Right, because often the question, the answer is no. And then just the issue of size, that we don't want to duplicate terabytes of data. So we've started working heavily on this. We have an SBIR through the NSF. To build a federated learning system. Kate Alpert on our team is leading the development process on that, so I'll let her talk a bit there.
Hi everyone, thanks Tim. So to the end of building sort of a federated learning enabled XNAT, there are kind of some various steps. At the kind of highest level is this notion of allowing your project to be kind of queried from a central location. I guess I should take a step back and just mention that, as Tim said, federation can be done in a peer-to-peer or hub and spoke. Right now, we're kind of looking at the hub and spoke infrastructure just because it's a little bit simpler. Clara federated learning is along that line. And it seemed like a bit of a heavy lift to try and have each XNAT also operate as sort of a central location, but I am interested to hear from you if that sounds better to you, if you're wanting to actually do this kind of thing from your home XNAT as opposed to a separate central location. So the way we've been looking at this is that project owners can, from the project settings page, set their project as searchable from a central location. This is kind of analogous to the notion of a protected project that you might be familiar with in XNAT already, where you're saying, I want to expose some information about my project, but certainly not my data. We are thinking that this would facilitate the return of some summary statistics, like age distribution and the types of features that you've collected on your data. So if it's, breast tissue density, or if it's lung segmentation, or, how are people going to actually make use of this data? Scan types would fall into this category, and certainly any other demographics that people are using. I guess I would mention data standardization as well, that as Tim mentioned, when you are sharing data, you want it to be apples to apples. So, socioeconomic status or education, we're returning these summary statistics, but how do we ensure that they are comparable? A step that we have been taking in this direction is the notion of JSON forms. And so this is going to facilitate a specification of fields by data type. You can see the kind of WYSIWYG there at the bottom of the screen that is backed by a JSON backend. And so these could be shared across projects, across XNATs, so that you actually do end up with kind of a consistent format for, okay, this is the education dropdown that the user is going to see. So then as we're sharing these summary statistics back to the central place, they actually are comparable. When you're at this central location and you're building your federated cohort, I'm curious to hear from you, what would you want to be filtering on as you decide which projects to include or exclude in your study? Obviously, you're going to want to make sure that you have comparable scan types or comparable features, but beyond that, what are you going to be interested in? And is it important to you to be able to query not just based on a full project inclusion or exclusion, but would you actually need to then kind of slice and dice, like I only need 80-year-olds from project A and, males from project B or something like that. So as we step into the actual processing, so I've built this federated cohort, I understand the demographics, the distribution that I have, and I want to actually run processing on this data. I want to run free surfer. I want to do machine learning. I want to do federated machine learning. I'm curious to hear from you about if you have data at your institution, what are you going to be comfortable with in this context? Federated learning, of course, is really designed to keep all data, isolated in its location, and the only communication back to a central server would be something like model weights. But perhaps you're interested more in research collaboration instead of, a federated learning. And so you would be willing to kind of centralize the data itself or the results. So I'm eager to hear about that. Also, how would you approve a container to run at your site if the data does need to stay local? What kind of information would you need to feel comfortable allowing users to launch in a federated fashion? And then finally, I'm interested to hear about people's experience with Clara federated learning, or if there are other federated learning infrastructures that you may have used or enjoyed. So that's XNAT Federation from me.
Okay, awesome. So there are a couple other groups in the community here. I was hoping for like a 60-second summary of your project from like Ryan Sullivan and Simon. If you guys could talk about what you're doing. Ryan, are you here? Can you unmute and give a real quick synopsis of what you guys are doing?
Yep. So I have the blessing and curse of trying to run two federations. So both the MS-based federation, which is a multinational research organization around multiple sclerosis. And I guess the bigger one is the Australian Imaging Service, which I think we're up to 15 universities, all with their own individual XNAT node, Clara node, etc. Integrating with the standard login, looking at building a standard portal. Importantly, having any instrument in any clinical site. You can export from an MRI. You can put the tag on which university you want to go to. It will de-identify and end up in the correct XNAT, and having standard processing so we can make ourselves much more attractive for multi-site studies. And we do the whole thing using Kubernetes so that we have a central code base. So if someone's on AWS, someone's on Azure, someone's on HPC, someone's on-prem, we can push an update and everyone gets the update, within an hour type thing, instead of 12 months of, oh, I haven't done this and that.
Awesome. Simon, can you chime in a bit and talk
Yeah,
about what
sure.
you guys are doing?
Okay, so the observation that we have in our local institution is that we have a very large number of users, and by and large, each user has a unique combination of projects to which they have access. And we think that potentially when there are multiple institutions involved and all the people sort of know each other, they're part of different projects in different institutions, then one very interesting thing to do is to make what data you access dependent very much on the individual user, not necessarily a particular federation of XNATs. So the scenario that we're building towards at the moment is one where a given user might have accounts on 10 different XNATs, each with different permissions on those XNATs, and we will then have a common authentication platform. We're basing ours on AWS Cognito, just because it's there and it's very easy to set up user pools on it. And that user pool, when you log in, let's say you have a client application, it could be the Rapid Reader, for example. We build the Rapid Reader into a separate application, which will then be able to define work lists where the data might be resident in a variety of different projects, and that will depend on what academic projects that user is involved in, has access to. And having logged into Cognito, it will return the authorization to all of those different XNATs without ever having to share the passwords directly or have them resident. And so then you'll be able to build up individual work lists, individual projects on a per user basis that reach into various XNATs.
Awesome, thank you. Is Matt South on the line? Is he able to unmute and give a quick synopsis? Matt's been running the DPK system now for years, so he has the unique situation that he has been running an XNAT federation for 4 or 5 years, which probably gives invaluable experience. What's your feedback on that in 60 seconds or so, Matt, if you're online? Okay, maybe we can pick him up later if he joins. So key questions. First one, this was interesting. We see a trend in using synthesis data for research purposes. FDA is also trying to use that strategy for machine learning model evaluation. With that being said, is there still a reason for XNAT federation?
I have trouble imagining that we'll have synthetic data anytime soon that replicates the heterogeneity of real-world clinical data. So while the FDA may be interested in that, I would imagine it being somewhere along the lines of a decade away. So yeah, we should still federate.
Also assumes that there's not new imaging modalities, which there's new technology being developed all the time and new disease modalities. So always a reason for federation. People want their own data, for better or worse.
All right, excellent. Next question. Have you looked at SAML as a federated authentication? Yes, many, many times. Feedback from the group on SAML as a federated authentication. I know Mohana spent a lot of time looking at it. If no one else Yeah, it's totally viable and totally probably the right solution here. It's been tricky to get there, get the implementation integrated with XNAT. I think that now there's services that that we could easily tie into that would get us there very quick. Will, you want to
go?
I was clicking on the thing just to kind of do some curation on the Q&A, just saying that we are answering the question live. It is. I think it is worth pointing out. I believe the Woostel key, the logins are SAML based, so that's at WashU something we could look at, as very very closely as an authentication integration.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest with Auth 2. It's a service we've looked at using that goes across all the in-common structures. Go ahead, Kate.
Are people who are doing federations across multiple XNATs generally using something like OpenID Connect or SAML for authentication on all of these different XNATs, or are you managing a bunch of different credentials across each component?
We're using
in the chat.
We're using OpenID across all the Australian ones. We have a national authentication service for universities and the hospitals, which is very nice that we can plug it into. It does give some complications with some of the clients which don't speak OpenID, but we predominantly use that for all users, and just say the clients that don't support that, we'll just ignore those and use other methods for uploading and downloading.
I can answer that for DPUK. Sorry, I wasn't. I was trying to get unmuted earlier. We just have a single LDAP authentication on our central node, and then individual at our central hub, and individual nodes do their own thing. So we didn't standardize across the whole network.
And then Matt, if you want to go quick, what kind of feedback would you have with 4 or 5 years of experience trying to do this in practice? What are your thoughts here?
Well, one of the lessons that we learned was that the governance needed to get from your node into the central hub was perhaps our biggest barrier. We got the technical stuff, something working up and running quite quickly, and so we've had quite a slow uptake. But when that's the case, you've got to keep on top of the versions of your XNAT in all the different places. So I was really keen to hear the Australian Kubernetes roll it out across the whole network solution to that, because we are in the opposite end of that solution. But yeah, I think that's the summary really.
Ryan, you're doing you have a poster on your Kubernetes structure, right?
Yeah. So I have a poster session. We've addressed everything except for the container service and how do we run that in Kubernetes. But we have the Helm charts and everything up on GitHub, and we'll be going live with the Kubernetes build in the next 2 or 3 months. So I can get more details on that.
Back to the governance thing. I think that goes well with Mark's question. Are you considering the integration of data privacy layers on the top, or is the assumption that all data will be already anonymized? Kind of gets into one of the core issues, as Matt points out.
So I think that from our point of view, we have 2 very distinct sides of the institutional firewall. So we have a whole set of servers on that we plan to federate on the public side, or on the academic side, I should say, of the firewall, and that is strictly anonymized data, and we spend a lot of time trying to keep it that way. However, the trend in the UK seems to be very largely that within the NHS, certainly large hospital trusts are creating these things called trusted research environments, in which potentially data with PHI can be used in the context of an XNAT. And the idea is that the hospital manage everything that occurs within that trusted research environment, and the data don't leak out.
Hey, Misha.
Sorry, can I step in,
Yeah.
just adding onto
Yep.
Simon's comment? So just on the TRE, so that's true that we've got this TRE within the trust, and then once you are within the environment, you can do anything you want. But I mean, some of the project that we are is basically setting federation across the different trusts. So that's why we need to have this data privacy layer at the top of every hospital, so that then we can have well, university and commercial partner training their model on the data that's still within the hospital, but without having access to the data. So that's why I was asking if I think it was the presentation from Kate at the time I wrote the question, if you were considering having this data privacy layer embedded within XNAT.
Kate, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So with federated learning, the idea is that the data, the central server doesn't really care if the data is anonymized or not, because it has no access to the data whatsoever. So the data at the site is going to be processed with the container that's running the training, and the only thing that would ever leave the data site would be model weights, and those can be actually contaminated to further preserve privacy and inject some noise. They can also be sent back encrypted, and the model averaging on the central server can leave the data encrypted actually, and still update the model. So privacy is kind of the primary concern here, and anonymization or de-identification is actually not particularly relevant. If you're looking at something kind of stepping back from federated learning, where you're just sort of doing a more federated processing approach, I think that's an interesting question, and potentially you could have an anonymization routine as part of whatever you send back.
No, but it seems like you do have means of. So, for example, if I was going to do federated learning, I could just say that I want to pull one data point per hospital. But if it looks like you're saying you've got mechanism to make sure that this is effectively corrupted, or we ensure there is aggregation which is done before sending anything. Thanks.
Right. Yeah.
And I will note that even with that, even saying that there's no chance data will leak out, it's still often going to be beneficial to a CIO or somebody to even say, yes, we're going to anonymize all this data before. There will be some CIOs who just won't even consider it without that. Well, the hope is that some will be open to that.
Yeah, and I would add that, by adding that setting at the project level where you're saying, yes, this project can participate in some sort of federated, cohort discovery or learning, that, potentially you could copy from your sort of native project into a new project that's going to be used for this sharing, and apply an anonymization as you do so.
You could totally see like a transition process as sites are coming onto the system. They may initially only do anonymized data in a subset of projects, and then as they get more comfortable with the process, maybe open it up.
And we've also seen sites with sort of a clinical XNAT and then a more public-facing XNAT, so two totally separate instances, one with identified data and one with anonymized.
And I will note, we do have one other, just one second, one other SBIR for anonymization. And one of the key features of that is bulk, being able to do a bulk review of DICOM data and non-DICOM data to assess whether or not it's adequately anonymized. Being able to look at 40,000 data sets in a realistic time span and say, yes, it's okay to share this data. So I see that as kind of part of this process, even though for learning, ideally it wouldn't be necessary. Because one of the biggest issues is that governance and getting the buy-in of leadership, it goes so far. Go ahead, I think it was Ryan.
Yeah, that was because one of the ways that we actually got governance across so many universities is we don't allow them to put any identifying textual data in the first place. So we strip that at the clinical site before upload as a matter of policy. And then it's things like tattoos and skulls, which complicated, but no direct identifiers are allowed.
Do you think, could you ever envision a scenario where there would be a sort of fully automated process where a user on a central server kind of identifies their cohort, requests permission from the project owners to sort of use that data in, let's say, federated learning? So the data is never going to leave the site, it's very restricted. The project owner, gets a notification, clicks yes, and then the user is actually able to launch this processing, and the central server and the client XNAT are in communication? Or does it feel like at your site that's just too automated and we need to kind of keep lots of manual steps where, the central server user makes a request and the project owner, then manually would launch the processing for the user from the central server?
So one of the use cases that we have, and in fact, one of the things that has the collaborations that we've got into since we started this whole federation business, is with another university in the UK, University of Leeds, which has something called Multics. And Multics is a quite interesting concept that it is a coordinator of, on the one hand, data sets, and on the other hand, resources, and thirdly, different processing tools, pipelines, containers, and so on. And it's like a broker for these things. And so they have actually a workflow to do precisely this. And we're interested to try it out, whereby the user on this Multics platform would actually go and have a browse of the library saying, these are the potential data sets that are available for sharing. These are the containers that the system knows about. And then you sort of point and click, spin up a relevant Amazon cloud resource or something to do the processing. And in the process of all that, you specify what you want to do. It automatically goes off, contacts all the PIs for the various studies, and there's a defined process for managing all the permissions in a nice workflow. And then ultimately everybody clicks exactly the button that you're talking about, and then you press go and it does whatever you want. So so those sorts of things are definitely out there. We haven't actually been through the process yet, but that's one of the use cases we're targeting.
Okay.
So I'm going to Yeah, I'm going to jump in. Obviously, this is, again, a topic of a lot of interest. I'd suggest those folks who are interested in continuing to talk about it should just go huddle around Ryan's poster. We'll just
might want to schedule a breakout meeting on it as well after the workshop.
Agreed. All right, so we've reached the end of this session. Again, thank you to all of our speakers and panelists and all of those who chimed in with questions and comments. It was a great, lively discussion, and I think for a virtual meeting about as interactive as we could make it in Zoom.